So we're at developing a vision for local outreach. Many of you guys are going to find yourselves pastoring a church, some of you in the next few months, and the odds are pretty good that when you land in your church, there's not going to be anything even remotely close to a local outreach vision inside of the church. Your evangelism ministry might look like, I don't know, a food pantry that nobody's been in for the past 6 months, and other than that, there really is likely not going to be much of a vision for local outreach or ministry from within inside of your church directed at the community. So you're going to be stuck in the position where you have to kind of develop everything. And frankly, in a lot of small churches, people look at that as the pastor's job. They look at it as, the pastor who's going to be the one reaching, going door to door and, witnessing to their neighbors. I can't tell you guys how many times I get phone calls from people saying, I got one yesterday from someone saying, my son is just being really rebellious. Would you contact him and talk to him and give him the gospel because I really want him to become a Christian? There's very much in a lot of our churches the idea that it's the pastor's job to be doing evangelism, to be doing local outreach, to be doing mercy ministries, to be doing the ethnic ministries. How many times have you guys seen an advertisement for a church that one of the criteria for their pastor is that they speak Spanish because their church needs to reach the Spanish-speaking community? There's not a single person in the church that speaks Spanish, but they're in a Hispanic community, and so they want a pastor that speaks Spanish so that they can reach their community. That's kind of the attitude of the pastor will do all of those things. And so it's going to fall on you to develop a vision for local outreach inside of your church and within the context of your local ministry. So you're going to have to kind of give your church priorities and cast a vision and lead them down that road. On top of all those challenges, you're going to be inundated with different ministries that want to move into your church, different parachurch organizations, different local communities, everything from secular groups from AA to homeless ministries to food banks to different ministries that want to do their gospel presentation will want to be coming into your church. And you could fill your pulpit every Sunday with another parachurch ministry if you wanted to. So that leads, the first thing I want to talk about, the goal of your vision is to develop within your church, and I think you guys have these in your notes, an attitude of love, a culture of evangelism, and a sense of purpose and urgency that makes people holy, and so that your church acts as a light for the lost. And with all those different tensions, that's going to lead you really quickly to the parachurch conundrum. And I know for some of you guys, parachurch is a dirty word. You want nothing to do with the parachurch. That's why you're at the Master's Seminary. Just don't think about the fact that the Master's Seminary is probably some form of a parachurch ministry in and of itself. And so when you think about the parachurch conundrum, this is my definition of what a parachurch is. It's an organization used by Christian churches to collaboratively work outside of a single church or denomination for the purpose of missions, social welfare, or evangelism. And of course, the problem with parachurch ministries is that you're not in control of them. You can't set the direction, you don't control the finances, you don't control the accountability of the leadership in the ministry, so it's not under your control. Essentially a ministry that's outside of your control that wants to use the church instead of the other way around. And of course, the strength of parachurch ministries is that it allows a church to accomplish something that it otherwise on its own would be unable to do. So when you look in your space in your notes for what it offers, that's pretty much the main thing that a parachurch organization offers. It offers the ability to do what a single church simply can't do. And probably the most common example of a parachurch organization that's I think is useful is something like the Union Rescue Mission. There's a 90,000 population of 90,000 homeless people in Los Angeles. How is the church going to reach those 90,000 people? How is even a church the size of Grace Community Church going to effectively minister to the homeless in the community? It's a task that's outside of our ability to do. And so we can bond together with other churches. We can pool our finances, pool our resources, and work together. Here's some examples of parachurch organizations. Grace to You would be one. I think the board members of Grace to You all have to be part of a local church, but not all of them are part of Grace Community Church. To work there, you have to be a member at Grace, but it still kind of fits under that umbrella, that it's not under the financial control of Grace Church. The elders at Grace Church don't control Grace to You. It's something that a lot of churches pool their money together in order to do. Campus Crusade would be another example. And again, if you find yourself if you're a small church in a community with a large college right next to it, you're going to suddenly see the allure of something like Campus Crusade, where evangelizing the campus that's across the street from your church is something that's outside of the ability for your church to do. And what's interesting to me, most of Campus Crusade missionaries are supported by churches that don't have colleges in their town. So when you think of like your average farm church or farm community out in the middle of the plains, they have a desire to evangelize the next generation. They're sending their students off to colleges in other cities. Campus Crusade is kind of an appealing organization for those kind of churches to be involved in college ministry. Union Rescue Mission, another one. A seminary is another example. One church can't have the world's leading Hebrew scholars and Greek scholars and theologians at one particular church. That's why seminaries kind of fall under that umbrella. So this is why they are good. This is why I think some parachurch organizations can be good. Some proverb somewhere says that many hands make light work. Many churches, when they bond together, can do things that one church would be unable to do. And that frees the church staff. It frees your church to shepherd the flock that's among you. It allows your church, when you partner with a parachurch organization to do things like minister to the homeless, it allows your own church to focus on the people that are inside of it. Here's another practical reason, very American practical reason. It frees your church from liability. Imagine the liability issues that your church would take on if you started a homeless shelter in your church. And again, the most obvious benefit, the main driving force, is that the idea that churches can do things that their numbers would not normally let them accomplish. And I don't know if the Southern Baptist Mission Board would be an example of a parachurch organization, because I guess it is tied to their denomination. But that, in my mind, is the quintessential example of many churches joining together to do something massive that one little church would be unable to do. Any other examples of reasons that parachurch organizations would be good that you guys want to add to the list? We'll do the negative part in a second.
It aids in congregational training.
Yeah, it aids in congregational training. I think what he means is that I couldn't train my congregation on some specific forms of ministry, but I could bring somebody else in to do that. Think of the way of the master going around doing their evangelism training inside of local churches, where some pastors would throw up their hands and say, I wouldn't know how to train my congregation for evangelism, but being able to bring people in to do that. RG?
It gives your church a sense of we're not all alone. There's something to be said if you're in a small 70, 80 church to get together with 5,000, 6,000 people and kind of go, there are other Christians in the world. What do you know?
Yeah. It gives your church a sense of not being an island, not being isolated, but an understanding of the brotherhood of believers. Well, there are some negative elements, obviously, to parachurch organizations. Curtis, hold on. You can't control what you don't administrate, which is a line that I've stolen from Pastor John. He says it often. You can't control what you don't administrate. In other words, if you're not in charge of the administration, the paying, the hiring of a ministry, you can't control the direction of that ministry. So you're working with a ministry that's outside of your control. So you're kind of at the whim of their direction. Secondly, there's generally no accountability through church discipline. And the first time you hear that, if you haven't thought about this before, when you first hear that, that might strike you as, knee-jerk, old-school fundamentalism. But I think there is something profound to be said with that, in that you're working with a parachurch organization, there's a Christian who's part of that organization who steals all your money, for example. What's your recourse then? Talking to Bob Provost in Albania, he ministers there. He said that his Lincoln Center, his main ministry there, often does a lot of, they have to do a lot of construction work. They're the second largest employer in Albania after the government. But he said they won't hire Christians to do contract work at their facility because what if a Christian cheats them? What if a Christian does a bad job, steals their money, etc.? They can't sue them, and they don't want to turn the Christian, they don't want to turn the Christian over to the police. And no church there practices church membership. There's really no recourse. They're not tied to a church. So he'll rather hire Muslims so that if they cheat him, or atheists, they cheat him, they can turn him over to the cops at least. But I think there's something to be said for that as it applies to a parachurch ministry. And third, it can undermine the authority of the local church. It has that potential. And it all depends on how you cast the vision as the pastor. Any other potential negatives you guys want to add to the list?
You might have to compromise on your doctrine in order to be a part of the group.
Yeah, you might have to compromise on your doctrine, or at the very least agree on some essentials that are perhaps more minimal than what defines your own church. Dan?
I think it plays into the kind of the whole idea of sitting back. A lot of times you fund parachurch organizations, and the church uses that almost as a way to say, well, we can't do this, which isn't necessarily true. Like there's if they're in a college town, they could go out evangelizing on the college campus. They could spend time on it. No, they can't spend as much time on it. No, they don't have as much experience. But it's a lot easier to say, oh, here's some money and we have Campus Crusade doing it. And saying, hey, you know what? I need to have a passion for these college students who go out and reach them.
Yeah, what Dan says is it can fuel apathy in the church. It can fuel this idea that, reaching that campus across the street is somebody else's job. I wrote my $25 check. Our church gave them, $75 a month for a year, so we're doing our job. Yeah.
It can drain resources from the church, too. Oftentimes people will give their money to the parachurch organization instead of to the local church.
Right, it can drain resources from the local church. Money being directed there. You hear about somebody giving Grace to you $1 million, and I think, wait, Grace to you? I mean, seriously. We're the church. Yeah.
Some people, I think, kind of become part of the parachurch organization as a replacement for the church.
Yeah, there's definitely a pull, and I think it's more true. At least my experience has been this is more true internationally than in the United States, but a lot of people will associate themselves with a parachurch organization over the church. I think in South Africa, the church I was ministering with there were all kinds of families that wanted to be involved with the church, but wouldn't come on Sundays because they were involved with the Christian hiking facility or the Christian retreat center on Sundays. Can pull people away from the local church. Well, this is why I think this is important for this section of the class. Much of local outreach is frankly neglected by local churches. And because of that, parachurch organizations prosper because people know they ought to do things like minister to the homeless, but they just don't actually do it. And so it's going to fall on the pastor to use some discernment. How do you get your church to either wean themselves from parachurch organizations or to make parachurch organizations something that you're using rather than are being used by that are using you? Do you see the distinction? Some parachurch organizations will use the church for their ends, and you as a pastor need to be discerning and either wean your church from being used by them or make the parachurch organization a tool that you yourself are using as the church. And the way you do that, I think, is by casting a vision for local outreach, defining your church's vision for reaching your community and for reaching the lost. And so the way we do this at Grace Church is we have this split into 4 different categories. We just split our vision for local outreach into 4 categories. So I'm going to walk you through those 4 categories pretty rapidly, and then I'm going to show you how they fit in at Grace Church. And so the first category I want to look at is mercy ministry or empathy ministry. And this is ministry that focuses on meeting the needs of those who are, I guess, the least in the society, the least of these. Examples of this kind of ministry are homeless ministry, orphan ministry, AIDS ministry internationally, a children's hospital outreach, a clothing drive, a soup kitchen, those kind of things, where the end of that is not necessarily the proclamation of the gospel. And again, the most obvious example of that is ministry to those. We do a ministry down the street at a hospital where people are in a non-responsive ward. They're unable to communicate. They're brain dead. So we'll go and sing to them, pray to them, read them scripture. The goal of that is not long-term discipleship in the church. Do you follow that? I mean, the person, if they understand, which is a big if, is never going to be able to respond. Think of, an AIDS ministry that's dealing with orphans that are going to die in a few years. They're 3-4 years old. They're not going to see their 7th birthday. The church ministers to those people, not with the goal of promoting the gospel and making baptism and disciples and sending them to the nations, but just with the end of meeting their needs. I think there's a room for that kind of ministry inside of a church. A clothing drive would be another example for that. I think there's room for meeting people's needs. Just stapling a track to the inside of the jacket you donate might not be the best way to do a clothing drive, for example. And so some components of a good mercy ministry, that it actually does meet people's needs. In other words, there are needs that are being met. That it's connected to a local church. And this is where I feel compelled to give Children's Hunger Fund a little shout out. Children's Hunger Fund, that really is the strength of that kind of ministry. I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with it, but that really is the strength of that kind of ministry. They do the food drives. They meet the needs of homeless in a way that's actually meeting their needs by providing them food and clothes and such, but they do it in a way that's connected to the local churches. They give the churches the ability to meet people's needs. A very immediate example is when the fire hit Sylmar at Grace Church. Our state senator for this area, Alex Padilla is his name, contacted Grace and wanted us to provide food and clothing for people that were displaced by the fires. Well, there's no way Grace Church, even a church our size, would be able to do that. We don't have a warehouse of clothing sitting on our ground. We have a soup kitchen with like 12 things in it. But going to something like Children's Hunger Fund, they're able to give us that kind of stuff. We can then meet the needs in the community. And then the gospel is proclaimed with accountability, or another way to say that might be the ministry is done with accountability. In other words, people are accountable for what they say and do. They're connected to the local church. They have oversight and accountability to them. Here's some questions to ask about mercy ministry. Is it actually meeting a need? Or is it just superficial? A lot of mercy ministries can have this superficial clothing on it, this kind of pious clothing, without really making a difference. And probably the most important question to ask about a specific mercy ministry is, what is the goal of the ministry? What is the goal of the ministry? What is the ministry aiming to accomplish? At least having that defined so that you know if you're doing it. You can ask yourself, is this a good use of resources? A lot of these kind of mercy ministries can be extremely time-consuming and resource-heavy with an undefined goal. And also ask yourself, is this something that would be better done through missions or through another local church? Common examples, Grace gets calls every now and then to send a chaplain to a prison that's 300 miles from here. And I don't know, something about that particular prison, they're persistent with us. But my response is continually, there's countless churches between here and there that would be better equipped that are in that community. It seems to be a better use of resources for another church to be meeting that need. Internationally, should our church be funding an AIDS orphanage in South Africa, or would our church be better off planning a church in South Africa and trusting that church with the oversight of that? It's very difficult to fund or manage an AIDS orphanage that's, 13,000 miles away. but it would be better to fund and plant a church there that would have oversight over that kind of thing. Those would be a couple examples I can think of. So here's some facts to realize about mercy ministry. The poor you will always have with you. And that's why your goal cannot be social change, because that will fail. You know, if your goal is to eradicate homelessness from your zip code, well, good luck. That's going to be impossible. People like, the big bang kind of ministry. People like flash in the pan, get everybody motivated. But it's difficult to maintain an interest for a sustained period of time. So before your church adopts a prolonged approach to ministry, you want to ask yourself, is this something that we want to be handcuffed to? Is this a ministry we want to be committed to for a long period of time? I have more I want to say about this, but because of time, we'll move on. But this is what I'm going to be teaching a session at the Shepherds Conference, if I can shamelessly plug it right now, that's on this exact topic. So if you're interested, you can come to that. Second form of ministry is excursion ministry. Excursion ministry. And what I mean by excursion ministry is things like going door to door, ministry to drug and alcohol rehab center, for example, where your goal is gospel proclamation, see people saved. Christmas concerts at Grace would be an example of this, something that we put on to reach the people in our community. Components of a good excursion ministry. It's received by people. In other words, people are open to hearing the gospel through those means. People are open to hearing the gospel. They don't slam the door in your face repeatedly. So just to use a very common illustration, door-to-door evangelism, going around door-to-door, may work in some communities and it might not work in some communities. If you've ever tried it in Santa Clarita, for example, it doesn't work in Santa Clarita. Nobody answers the door. Nobody wants to talk to a missionary at their doorstep in Santa Clarita. Generally, that's at least been my experience. In our community here, it's very effective, maybe because of the large ethnic population, but people are very receptive to having people come knock on the doors to give them the gospel. So you just want to ask yourself, in my community, is this particular approach to evangelism working? We do here at Grace, we open our gym once a week for people in the neighborhood to come and play basketball in, and then somebody gives them a gospel presentation. That's very well received in this community. The gym is always full. It wouldn't make sense to do that in a community where people don't show up, for example. So just the basic question is this an actual avenue for preaching the gospel? Does it give you the opportunity to clearly proclaim the gospel? So, just some questions to ask about it. Is it effective? In other words, is it working? Is the gospel being clearly proclaimed? And some people have a hesitation to ask that question, but I think it's a fair question to ask. Especially in smaller churches, there's this perception of, well, we've always done this ministry. It's a question that is tantamount to saying that you don't like evangelism. But it does seem to be a fair question to ask, is this working? Is the gospel being proclaimed? Are people getting saved? It seems to be a fair question to ask. Here's some facts to realize about excursion ministry. It can produce if you're not doing this, you're not evangelizing mentality. There's something about it that gives people this tendency to think that if you're not involved with this particular ministry, then you're not evangelizing. We've talked about that before. This kind of ministry requires training and teaching. It requires the pastor to teach people what they're supposed to say, how to evangelize, to give them some direction. Do you guys have any questions or comments on empathy, or excursion ministries. Yeah.
So like the main difference between the first one and this one is that the first one you're not sharing the gospel?
Right, that's the way I distinguish it in my mind. The main difference between those two categories so far is with the first category, the goal is not gospel proclamation. You're not measuring success by, is the gospel being clearly proclaimed, are people getting saved and added to the church? Whereas the second one, that is the goal, and so that is how you're measuring success. I think it is helpful you guys might disagree, but I think it is helpful to distinguish between those two kind of ministries because it helps you evaluate the success of those kind of ministries. And if your goal is to get clothes together to give to the homeless so that they're warm the next few weeks, you're going to measure the success of that kind of ministry differently than if your goal of this kind of ministry is to get the homeless together in a park so that you can clearly proclaim the gospel to them. So I think it's helpful at the beginning of starting one of those ministries to define what it is exactly you're aiming for here. That way you can at least tell if you're hitting it. And you're free in your own church to say, well, we don't want to do the just put a jacket on them one, or we don't want to do the just proclaim the gospel to them one. Or you're free to say, hey, let's try to do both of them. It's been my experience that trying to combine those two kinds of ministries often is not effective. You guys may have more skill in that area, though, and more wisdom. And yeah.
You had door-to-door ministry in your church, and then you some time along the way you asked people, so the question would be that how many of you are actually getting a good opportunity to kind of do an evaluation based on that, and then you say nobody's getting a good opportunity, let's try something else kind of deal?
Yeah, definitely.
It's not based on like number of souls won, it's based on more, have you had a good
Right.
opportunity to present?
Right. And because I'm a practical Calvinist, I see those two as connected. You know, the more opportunities you have to clearly proclaim the gospel, the more people are going to get saved because the Lord has his people and he'll use preaching the gospel to reach them.
What are some reasons you found that they don't, coupling them together in the same event don't work too well?
My experience has been that it can give a sense of duplicity, like a sense of, we'll give you this jacket if you listen to us talk. Now, obviously, your goal for somebody is not just to be warm and well-fed. Your goal for somebody is to be warm, well-fed, and saved. But that's why I think that you have different tools in your toolbox and different approaches. But also because of the cognitive ability of some people. If you're ministering to people who are brain dead or who are orphans who aren't going to live very long, you probably have a different approach to it and a different goal than you do if your goal is to get people saved and added to the church and trained up. Brad?
Maybe I misunderstood you, but did you say that that's duplicity if you say, I'll give you a code?
I think it could lend itself to being duplicit. Yeah, it could lend itself to that kind of impression. Which, again, there's nothing wrong with combining those two. I think the main point is that you should clearly articulate what your goal is at the outset. So just define, all I'm telling you guys is you should define your philosophy of ministry before you start it, rather than starting it and kind of seeing how it's working. So just think it through. Okay, I mean, again, because if your goal is to give people the gospel, and you're using coats to attract them there to give them the gospel, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, as long as you've defined your goal at the beginning.
Because I think that may be why many churches have just abandoned mercy ministries altogether.
Mm-hmm.
It's because if they don't do that, and you just open up a soup kitchen or you just open up a clothing outlet, so to speak, then you have an endless line of people.
Right.
But when you say from the outset that the expectation is that we want to sit down and spend 15 minutes sharing the gospel with you, or 30 minutes, that's going to greatly reduce the line.
Right.
But you've made, as you just said, you've made your intentions very clear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that may bring, if churches will start thinking in that way, then we may be able to recapture a vision for reaching out to people this way.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Yeah.
Question right off what you said. So you make your intentions clear to people working with you in ministry, or to every object in ministry, the homeless people or whatever, you somehow let them know ahead of time, or do you just make that goal clear to the people that are ministering?
I think as the pastor, you have to cast the vision to your people, and then they implement it, I think.
If the people coming to the church, you have an ad somewhere, a sign, they don't necessarily have to know ahead of time that once you give them a meal or a Coke, that they're sitting down eating it, that they're going to get a gospel presentation?
I think what Brad was saying is that if they do know that, it will reduce the demand on your church, and that might be a good thing for a particular church.
So it's kind of case by case whether you
Yeah, just the point is you need to cast the vision, have your goal, because that's going to determine. I mean, if your goal is to give out as many coats as possible, then maybe you don't say that. If your goal is to give out fewer coats but have a longer time with each individual, then I think Brad's point is you do say that, and then you're accomplishing your goal. So just want to clarify the vision. Third form of what I consider local outreach ministry is equipping ministry. And this is how you equip your people to, I guess, is part of the training of them. I have in my notes how you equip them from conversion to membership. How you guide them from conversion to membership. And so what I mean by that, the examples, that would be like a new believers class or a baptism ministry, and we'll talk about that more in a second. Components of a good equipping ministry: you've got qualified and knowledgeable teachers. Some questions to ask about equipping ministry. I'll just give you one. Is this replacing normal fellowship and growth inside of the church? What I mean by that is there's a temptation often in kind of new believers classes to replace the normal fellowship that somebody would have if they were, to use an educational term, mainstreamed. I think that's enough about that. Fourth is ethnic ministry. And this in Los Angeles has it's probably more complicated than any other city in the world, I think. Ethnic ministry is I call it ethnic just because it starts with an E, so it keeps with the outline. But what I mean by that is language ministry, foreign language ministry. So you have an English language church, how you do ministry to reach those in your community that don't speak English. So components of a good ethnic ministry: it's actually reaching the community. It's evangelistic. But here's where it gets tricky. Here's some questions to ask about ethnic ministry. Is your ministry connected to a doctrinally sound local church? And what I mean by this, there's especially Southern Baptist churches there in Los Angeles, there's a big temptation, and a lot of them actually do this. They'll have the ethnic church that meets at their church. And in some sense, Grace Community Church does this with the Spanish ministry right there. So there's picture this idea of a church within a church kind of concept, where people come, they attend, they have their own pastoral leadership, they give money to their own ministry. It's really a church inside of a church. You want to ask yourself, is this church here, is it doctrinally sound? Is it connected to my church in a real way? Do we have oversight of it? Do we have actual oversight of it? Not just do I know the guy's name when I see him in the hallway who's pastoring it. And second, is your church ready for this kind of commitment? There's so many churches, again, in Los Angeles that just have this desire to have an ethnic language, or an ethnic church, a foreign language church inside of their building, without realizing that this is a huge commitment. It's a huge commitment. It's a commitment in time. It's a commitment in resources. It will require sacrifices. What's the relationship between this group and your church? Having that clearly defined at the beginning. Are the people who attend it members of your church? Are they members of this group here? Is it a dual membership? How does that work? Who are the elders? What's the oversight of it? How do your elders give oversight to that group when they don't speak the language? And is it defined clearly? You see so many church splits and so much tension from just not defining those things at the outset. And just walk yourself through this typical example. There's a church of 50 people. They hire you to be the pastor. And in Los Angeles, this is becoming more and more common. They hire you to be the pastor. So now you're pastoring an English language church. You've got 50, 60 members. Most of your community speaks, I don't know, choose any language. Choose Spanish because it's probably most common. So you hire a Spanish language guy as one of your outreach guys. He starts his own ministry, his own church. Your church is at 10:30, so they're meeting at 12:30. Their church grows and grows and grows until they have 60 people, 70 people, 80 people. Well, what happens next? Do they take over the 10:30 time slot? What happens when one of your older people wants to use that building for some kind of reception, a wedding reception, Sunday at 1 o'clock when they're meeting? How do you navigate that? Do you cancel that ethnic group for this other function that's going to have 12, 15 people at it? There's this big tension, and I can't tell you how many times church splits happen over those kind of things. Money, there's the tensions between this group is growing. Where's their money going? There can be all sorts of problems that arise from that you often don't even think about until you find yourself into that situation. So it's just helpful to ask those kind of questions before you start, before you begin. Just getting everything defined at the beginning. Andrew. That's what you have to ask. That's what you have to ask. Is this going to be a church within a church, or is this a church plant that's on our building, that's on our campus? How is it going to be defined? You need to just ask that and define it as you start to avoid the pitfalls. And there really is this tendency in a lot of churches that there's this desire, we want to have an ethnic ministry, but it will never be really embraced by people. Again, often you'll see things like, we want to have a joint worship service. Okay, well, all right, so you bring them in, but all the songs are in English. Okay, and then people have animosity. How come none of them show up to our joint worship service? Or you have a joint worship service, but it's always the English language pastor that preaches, and it's translated into the other language. How come it's not the other way around? How come that group is bigger? They get the cheesier building. They get to meet in the basement. Well, all 40 of you are meeting upstairs. Then when you invite them into your building, all of these songs are in English, and you give them one, patronizing song at the end in their language. And you always teach and it's translated into their language. If you don't think about those things beforehand, it can be a huge source of tension. And my encouragement to you guys would be to have those kind of ministries defined by language more than by ethnicity. And some of you may be involved in these kind of churches, but this is probably a more tendency in the Asian community more than the Spanish community. But you'll have the Asian language church with the English language youth group. Okay, that's out of necessity. But then you have another English language ministry as part of that, because what happens when those kids go to college? And before you know it, you have a church that's defined culturally and ethnically more than linguistically. I have a Bible study at CSUN that we meet right next to the Korean Campus Crusade for Christ. And that just raises a lot of questions in my mind about, the teaching in English, why the Korean Campus Crusade for Christ? What's the goal behind that? Why the English language Korean ministry parachurch? Just raises questions in my mind. And they meet right next to us. So we've had in the past white students that walk in there, and then the Korean ministry adopts them and wants them to be part of their ministry. And that just raises even more questions. Just things to think about at the beginning as you start those kind of ministries. Any questions or comments on that? Again, these are things that you're probably not thinking of now, but if you stay at a church in Los Angeles, you're going to face these issues. And so I just want you to think about them ahead of time. Yeah.
So you mentioned the Spanish-speaking ministry here at Grace as an example. How do you guys overcome some of those practical issues?
Well, we have their membership is part of our membership. So we have joint membership. That keeps it, I think, from being a church within a church. Their pastor, and they have an associate pastor, they're elders at the church. So they're elders just like the other pastors. The pastoral meetings, they're always together. So it really avoids this sense of us versus them by having everybody in the same team, I guess. It helps they meet simultaneously. Church has put a lot of money into that building to make it nice and acceptable. So we really want to avoid the idea of like a second-class kind of ministry. So those are just basic things. Their money, they go into their own designated fund, so they give their money, they keep their money, they spend their money. So it's kind of stays within that ministry. But then that ministry also draws from the church's general budget, which keeps it tied for accountability. And that's not the only way to do it. You could have the money going to one pool. You could have your church not supporting them financially. But I think as long as you think through it clearly and define it clearly, that will avoid most of the problems. It's not so much there's a right way or a wrong way to do these kind of ministries as much as it is defining what you're doing at the beginning. None.
When this happening, like here in the church in the church, does it? How do you work with splitting the families? Like kids go to the English speaking, parents go to the Spanish speaking.
Right.
Is there a problem in that, or
You know, we haven't had those kind of problems here because the kids, again, even with our Spanish ministry, which is our biggest one, the kids from that ministry are all speak English, so they're going in the normal Sunday school group. When they get to college, they're in Crossroads with everybody. We have one college ministry, so yeah, we haven't seen problems with it. But I could see how in some churches there would be those problems, for sure. All right, what I want to look at real quick is I just want to bring you guys through how we run local outreach here at Grace. This is kind of our vision statement. Well, let's do the first three. Actually, the first two are the most important ones. Our principles for local outreach here at Grace, the things that we stress as we craft our vision for local outreach is that evangelism is a lifestyle, not an event. And I've said that a few times for you guys, but I really think it's important, so I just want you to write that down at the end of your notes. Evangelism is a lifestyle, not an event. And because of that, it's about people, not about programs. So we very much want to structure our evangelism being around people rather than programs, encouraging people to engage in these kind of ministries, not having programs that do those kind of ministries. Programs come and go, and programs are often destined for failure. Most programs are simply not effective. You hear people ask, what does your church do for evangelism? What does your church do for mercy ministries? And my response is often, what do you do for evangelism? What do you do for mercy ministries? There's this tendency to evaluate a church's evangelistic health by the number of programs that they have, which I don't think is a good way of evaluating a church's health. You could almost make a stronger argument that the number of programs a church has towards evangelism could conceivably be a sign of weakness. That its evangelism and mercy ministries is not part of a person's daily life, but are rather compartmentalized. Let me explain to you how this works out, what our practice is. Again, we already talked about, we have the 4 categories. I just want to show you guys what kind of ministries we do at Grace. Again, not because you would be able to replicate any of these in a smaller church, but to give you ideas of things that fit in to these categories. So under equipping, we have 4 things under equipping. We do Grace Evangelism, which is an evangelism training class where we equip our people how to evangelize. And we've talked about that before. We do new believers classes, fundamentals of the faith classes, where when people get saved, we steer them towards this class. It's about 20 weeks long, which is long for a new believers class, but it's super effective. And I would say, of all of the programs we do for evangelism, this is the most effective at seeing people get saved. If you attend Grace and you hear the baptisms, which is next on the list, that's probably the ministry that people say they got saved in more than any of the other programs. Our baptism, the way we do baptism here is very evangelistic, by the way. So a person gets saved, they go to a class where they're just taught what baptism is, and they meet with a person who talks through their testimony with them, and that person makes a decision. Is this person, do they have a real understanding of the gospel? If so, we baptize them and encourage them to attend an FOF class, or are they still struggling with their understanding of the gospel, in which case we send them to the new believers class before baptism. When they do finally get baptized, we have them read their testimony in front of the whole congregation. If you haven't seen that, I would encourage you to come to one of the night services here at Grace. It's a very powerful way to do baptism because of how evangelistic it is. A lot of people sitting in the pews have built up their defenses to Pastor John. They know what he's going to say. They know how to avoid his gospel presentation from affecting their heart. But seeing somebody in the water give a testimony is a very powerful evangelistic tool. So we make our baptisms very evangelistic. And then we also provide resources. We have, on our website, a message from Pastor John, 2 Paths One Way, translated into 40 of the most common languages in our zip code here. We give out CDs with those gospel presentations on the patio every Sunday. So we're trying to give our people the ability, and in English and Spanish as well, we want to give our people the ability to share the gospel with those in their community. So those are just 4 things we do to equip our people for evangelism. As far as evangelism or excursion, it's just a list of things that we do. We go to rehab centers, county-run drug and alcohol rehab centers. Let us go there and run kind of a church service. They invite the residents there. We do music, preaching, prayer. We're involved in homeless shelters where we do Bible studies. We have a dozen or so people that go up every week to do the same kind of thing, church services inside a Wayside Correctional Center, which is the largest jail in Los Angeles County. We have a Bible study here on campus on Monday nights for people who are struggling with what we call life-dominating sins, drug and alcohol addictions. We have various sports outreaches, visitor outreaches, hospital ministry where we go to hospitals and invite patients to kind of, again, a church service. We go bed to bed, as it were. And then we have door-to-door kind of ministries. Ethnic ministries, these are the different ethnic ministries we have here. There's one missing, but I can't think of what it is. And that's just because those are the most prominent languages in our community. Italian. Thank you, Lucio. Lucio actually leads our Italian ministry. And then these are the different kind of empathy or mercy ministries that we do. Working with the Children's Hunger Funds, going to children's hospitals, rescue missions, and then the non-responsive wards. We also do a Bible study at the psychiatric ward, where people who are found not guilty by reason of insanity are sent. That's a crazy place to do ministry. Again, when you go into a church, you're obviously not going to be able to do all of these ministries. These are just to give you ideas of different ways you can get your congregation involved in reaching your community. Every major metropolitan area in the country has drug and alcohol rehab centers. They have jails. They're never crowded. It's not like there's a long line of churches that want to do Bible studies there, and they're having to constantly turn all these churches away. It doesn't work like that. Most of these places are eager to get other ministries involved with their work there. Hospitals are the same way. Often hospitals are very eager to have churches come alongside and do things. And as long as you approach those kind of ministries in a winsome way, where you're not argumentative, you always ask people permission. Can I pray with you? Can I read you the Bible? If they say no, you move on to the next bed. It's a big hospital. As long as you have that kind of approach, hospitals are eager to have people there. Drug and alcohol rehab centers, jails are eager to have volunteers that do those kind of things there because they can't do it. I mean, jails and drug and alcohol rehab centers especially, they want to provide they're so liberal they'll accept anything. They want to provide religious instruction to their people, but they can't do it. They can't afford to have a chaplain. So if a church comes alongside and says, hey, we'll do a Bible study here once a week, we're not going to make people come, we'll just invite people. Most places are very eager to have that kind of thing. Just ideas for you and how to get your people involved in those kind of ministries.
Does it ever get to a point where they want to become independent? And have you dealt with that in the past here at Grace Church?
Yes. And that, again, if you don't have the vision articulated at the beginning, it can be very tricky. But yeah, there's been a couple of them that have separated and started their own church. There's one, our Arabic ministry, came from another church that incorporated in here. So it was the other way around. So yeah, we would send them off with our blessing.
Philosophically speaking, though, do you have a vision where you actually encourage that to happen, or is it neutral? You kind of allow it?
Yeah, it's case by case. A lot of them are very, evangelistic. I think of our Armenian ministry as a good example of that, where the people who teach the Armenian ministry are part of the main worship service at Grace. They speak English, they've been members of Grace for forever, but they have a desire to reach the Armenian community, and a lot of their friends and relatives don't speak English, so they started an Armenian kind of ministry to reach them. When people get saved, they're not going to stay at the Armenian ministry for long, they'll get plugged into to an Armenian church. Okay, let's look at crafting a philosophy of missions. Again, a lot of you are going to find yourself in a church, that doesn't have a philosophy of missions. Again, I'm picturing most of the stereotypical small 100, 200 member churches where many of you are going to find yourself pastoring in the next few months. You're going to walk in there and you are going to see a very disjointed approach to missions. Most small churches spend $100 a month on 20 missionaries. You'll walk into a church with, 200 people, and they'll have their missions map on the wall. Do you guys know the map I'm talking about? And it's got all the pins of like 20 people. That'd be a fifth of their church. With a little string coming out with a picture of the family serving in France. I'll almost guarantee you that nobody in the church knows that family. That family isn't from that church. They weren't trained up by that church. And the church's connection to them is sending them $100 a month. And that's very much, I think, the shotgun approach to missions. It's this whole idea of, funding all of these people all over the world. The reality is most of these people got funded through some weird connection to the small church. So you're walking into a political minefield. That family in France, that's some person at the church who's been there longer than you, that's their nephew's neighbor or something like that, their nephew's roommate from college. And if you were to stop funding that person, well, that's civil war inside of your church. Those people are very entrenched within one or two families, and beyond that, nobody even really knows who they are. That's been my experience with the kind of missions at smaller churches. Let me tell you some problems with what I'm calling the shotgun approach to missions. Missionaries are stretched thin. Put yourself in the position of one of those missionaries. You have a church supporting you for $100 a month. How many different churches do you need to support you at $100 a month in order for you to make this whole thing work, especially if you're in Europe? I mean, you're probably bringing in $60,000 a year for your support. If you're bringing less than that, then you don't have a family or you're not in Europe. Even if you're in Africa, the cost on airfare and everything that goes into that, you're probably needing $60,000 or $70,000 a year to support yourself in missions. If you're getting supported by a church for $100 a month, one of you can do the math on that. That's a large number of churches that you have supporting you. That's what I mean by you're stretched thin, because think about what that looks like practically. When you come back on furlough, you're expected to visit the churches that are supporting you financially. Well, that's not a vacation. That's not a furlough. That's a jet tour around the country. When I was in South Africa, one of the guys that taught at the school that I was at was this kind of missionary. He came home, and this is what his family did. They would rent like a Winnebago RV style thing, and they would drive, and they would spend a 2-month furlough going to just driving church to church. It was like a rock concert tour. They needed a vacation after their furlough in order to recover. Secondly, when they're on the field, you've got that map with their picture on the wall and the yarn going to the string in Polokwane, South Africa. There's 100 churches that are doing that. This church, how many of those churches want to send a short-term missions team every summer? They thought, hey, it would be good for our college kids to get a taste or an experience of what missions life is like in South Africa, so they send a team. So let's just say only 25 of those churches send teams throughout the year. And let's pretend that you don't have 2 teams at once. And going to Africa, that average trip is going to be a week and a half or 2 weeks. Well, your full-time job then as a missionary is hosting these STM teams because this church gives you $100 a month. You're completely stretched then. You come home on furlough, you can't make ends meet, you're in the field, you constantly have people visiting you. Or it's just, the one guy, the one college student who wants to spend his summer helping his missionary. That's noble on the American end of the equation, but when you're on the African end of the equation, you have this whole army of, single college people camped out in your church to help you over the summer. Financially, you're stretched thin. You're just barely making ends meet. If you have a need, what do you do with your need? You need a new car, okay? $15,000. You need a new car. You can't go to a church that's giving you $100 a month and ask them to buy you a $15,000 car. Do you go to all of your churches and ask for an extra $1,000? If they're supporting you $100 a month, they're not going to give you $1,000. Also, the church has no real connection to most of its missionaries. The church has no real connection to most of its missionaries. The church doesn't know those people. If the church is supporting 20 missionaries at $100 a month, the people in the congregation don't know the names of the missionaries. They don't know what they're doing out there. They just trust that they're doing something with that money. And frankly, most churches don't care what they're doing. They're giving them $100 a month. They're not going to read the status reports from those guys. They don't care. As long as they don't get arrested, short of that, most churches are fine with their ministry. The missionaries have no meaningful accountability or support structure. So put yourself in the shoes of your missionary in Africa. This is an example from one of our missionaries. Shannon Hurley is in Uganda, ministering in Uganda. He's getting tension from the denomination. He's working with a particular denomination there. They want him to totally change the way he's doing ministry. He's having problems with, his house. They want to steal his land from him. It's a huge debacle over there. He needs help and he needs wisdom. Not just the encouragement, you're doing a good job, pal, but he needs actual wisdom from people who have been in that situation before. Well, what do you do if he's being supported by 20 churches, 30 churches, 40 churches? Where do you get wisdom from? Do you call those pastors up? Do you have a conference call where they all get together? What do you do if you're having wisdom issues with your church? You're a church planning pastor. You're planning a church. You're being supported by all these other pastors in the States. And you have a situation where you need wisdom. You have a counseling situation you need help on. You have no real support structure. And the other problem with this approach to missions, it probably shows a lack of focus on the church's approach to missions. The church that's doing this kind of mission work, they don't have a real goal in their missions work. Their goal is just to give out $100 a month to as many people as possible. Makes the map look more full on the wall. Now, the reality is when you go into a church, most churches are going to have this approach to missions. Giving $100 to the Campus Crusade guy who's at University of Wyoming, giving $100 to the church planning pastor in South Africa, giving $100 to a translator to Wycliffe in the Philippines. They're all over the place. So, your job as the pastor is to craft a philosophy of missions for your church. You walk in, and this becomes your task. And again, this is a very delicate needle to thread. By the way, Jack Hughes, thank you. No, I like to think of it as Jack Hayford. Jack Hughes, I took one of his classes when I was in seminary on missions, and he gave this advice to new pastors. Most churches, especially if you're in Southern Baptist Church, are filled with committees where everything is run by committee. And the advice that he gave was to get yourself as a senior pastor on the missions committee. Sell out everything else. You don't need to be on the building committee. You don't need to be on the membership committee. Get rid of all of that. Other people will do that just fine. But put yourself on the missions committee, which, again, in most small churches, nobody wants to be in the missions committee. If it's a church that's run by committee, it's not one of the politically charged committees. But if you put yourself there, you're leading by example as far as your passion for evangelism, and you'll be in a position to actually change the way things work. So your first step in crafting a philosophy of missions is to choose a method of missions. To choose a method of missions. And what I mean by a method of missions is, here's some different examples. Is your church going to focus on church planning? Is your church going to focus on seminary training or on mercy ministry? On street evangelism or something like Campus Crusade? On literature production, on school teaching? Those are all valid forms of missions work. And just choosing one of these, if you're at a smaller church, right away clarifies your vision for missions. You get, even small churches, you get inundated from all of these other missionaries that are being supported by churches for $100 a month. They're trying to make ends meet. They're, sending letters to everybody. How do you say yes to some, no to some? How do you focus? Well, things like this, decisions like this will help you focus where you're putting your resources. Is your church going to focus on printing Bibles to distribute in Spain, for example? Is your church going to focus on supporting school teachers to teach at schools for missionaries in Papua New Guinea? Is your church going to focus on the kind of door-to-door evangelism that might be effective in France? Is your church going to focus on AIDS orphanages in Africa? TMAI stuff like seminary stuff around the world? Church planning. Just strategically choosing which road you're going to go down. Second, choose a geographic location. Where are you going to target? What continent, what country? This allows the congregation to get focused on one area through prayer, giving, and affections, and that's a big one. So the people in the church know what to be praying for, and their heart follows after it. I think more effective in getting your people to pray for missions and getting them to actually care about missions, more effective than the map on the wall with people shotgunned all over the world, is a specific target area, a specific kind of ministry that your people get regular updates on. They get involved with it. They know how the church plant is going. They're praying for that specific church plant. They know how the Bible distribution in Spain is going. They're hearing testimonies from people that got saved through that. They're receiving letters of thanks from churches that are receiving their support. So they can become passionate about those kind of things. When they're involved in 20 things all over the globe, you can't be passionate about any one of them. But when it's focused on one area, they pray more passionately for it. They give more of their money for it. If your church is focused on church planning in Uganda, for example, and the missionary tells them, look, we really need a van to bring people to our church, now you can bring that kind of request before your congregation. This is what they've been praying for. Their heart is with this missionary, and they're more likely to meet the need. It also makes it easier for the church to say no to other requests. So say your church is focused on Bible distribution in Spain, and you get a request from a seminary in the Philippines that really needs an air conditioning for their education building. Well, if you're not focused, you feel like saying no to this guy is saying that you don't love Filipinos. But if you're focused, you can say, hey, very easily, no, our church, that's not how we do our missions. If you're focused on Bible distribution in Spain and you get a request from a company that's producing Bibles in there that their rent just went up and they need this gift in order to make rent, that's the Lord's way of working inside your congregation, of using you to meet that need. So just being focused allows you to delegate your resources more effectively. Third, choose your missionary. Choose the person that is going to be carrying out your missions work. And choose him carefully. My advice to you would be to choose him from inside of the church. And again, I'm obviously talking a long-term goal of missions here. Because if you're going to par down your number of missionaries, if you're going to put all the proverbial eggs in one basket here, you want a good guy doing this. Choose him from inside of your church, somebody that you guys know. That way your church will adopt him. Even if you're viewing long-term here, like even if this means sending the guy to seminary, if you're doing church planning, for example, you'd want to send him to seminary. even if it means giving him the right kind of training, giving him the language training, even if it means he's not going to hit the field for another 4 or 5 years, it's better to have the right guy than an immediate guy. Or some churches are just unable to do that. You can choose from an organization that the church trusts. And that's where, at Grace Church, that's where GMI comes in, Grace Ministries International. There's a lot of churches that have money for missions and want to adopt this kind of missions, this kind of philosophy for missions, but they don't have a guy. They don't have a missionary. You know, there's churches that want to support AIDS orphanages in Africa, but they don't have a person to send there. So they come to GMI and we say, yeah, we have the perfect person. You guys can support them. They want to support church planting in the Philippines, but they don't have a guy to go there. We say, we have the guy. Put the two together. The goal with this whole approach is to support as much as possible as many missionaries as the church can be financially and morally responsible for. So what I mean by this is that generally speaking, fewer is going to be better in most small churches. It's better to perhaps support one guy with $15,000 a year than it is to support 15 guys with $1,000 a year. 20 guys at $100 a month or one guy at $15,000 a year is the same. Yeah.
I think your next point is going to answer my second question. The first one, I actually asked one of the deacons at my home church in Chicago about doing it this way.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things he mentioned in opposition to it was that if there's obviously, trusting the Lord with these kind of situations. If there was a political situation in a foreign country, a church doesn't have the capacity to pull that missionary out of there quickly, but a missions organization does.
Right.
What's happening with grace and stuff like that?
Yeah. Did you guys hear the question? If something were to happen inside of a country, a church doesn't have the ability to be politically involved in ensuring the safety of their people. So if you're supporting a missionary in Nigeria and civil unrest, consumes the town that he's in, your church, what is your church going to send in the Navy or the Marines and go fetch the guy? But a missions organization would have the ability to ensure his safety. And I definitely agree. Every country is different. If you've got a guy in Spain, maybe you don't need a sending organization. You just put him on a plane and email and Skype and everything, you're communicating with them all the time. But if you someplace more remote, maybe you do need a sending organization. And so Grace is not like other churches in that sense. We are our own sending organization. We have the financial ability that we send missionaries. We are our own sending organization. But this is not an enemy of sending organizations. Not all of our missionaries are even sent through GMI. Some of our missionaries go through other sending organizations. I think of a couple off the top of my head, but they're sent through another organization. We're just their financial support. So these two can go hand in glove. You can use an organization like SENS or even a Southern Baptist organization. You can use one of those organizations, but it's your money, it's your guy, it's your missionary. So. This will probably in most churches look like fewer people, but it should, my perspective is it should increase your church's love for missions. Now, before we talk about how to implement this, do you guys have the vision here?
What about just like with committees and everything, it doesn't seem like missions is always stable. And having like one person supported $15,000 a year by a single church, if your church all of a sudden got somebody on the missions committee and just said, we don't want to do that anymore, it's like it destroyed that mission.
Right, which is why you as a pastor are on the missions committee. This is not something you can delegate if you want to try to implement it. It's something that you have to be leading. Which means it's the guy. I'm not from Calvary Bible, but my impression from talking to people on their missions committee there is that they have this approach to missions, and they view their people as their missionaries as part of the staff of the church. That they're the church staff. So they'd be treated with the same respect, and getting rid of them would be the same process as getting rid of one of the associate pastors. You can't just put a new person on a committee who says, oh, I don't like the children's ministries pastor, let's get rid of him. Well, that doesn't work. He's part of the church. He's one of the leaders in the church. Okay, let me tell you how you implement this. You need to wean your other missionaries. And there's a delicate process for this. Remember, the goal of this is to get a church focused on missionaries, on missions specifically. If you don't have a philosophy crafted and articulated, you have no grounds to wean other missionaries. In other words, if you don't have something written, if you can't tell one of these guys we're focusing on church planning in Uganda, then you have no justification for weaning your other missionaries. You need to give them ample notice of what you're doing and why. You need to tell them why you're weaning them from their support. Give them a year's notice. Say, look, we're giving you $100 a month. We're going to stop that 1 year from now. We'll give you $100 a month for a year. And then explain to them why. The advantage that you have in doing this is that most missionaries are very godly. And when you explain to them what your church is doing, they will probably like it. They'll be $100 a month shy, but they will probably understand for the kingdom that it's better. Give them an end date that coincides with one of their returns to the States. This is a practical tip for you. Find out when their next furlough is. Tell them you're ending their support when they come back to the States in that furlough, because that gives them the opportunity to find another church. And you could even make an effort to find them other avenues of support. And remember, this has to come from the missions committee and the elders, not from you. Because of how politically delicate this is. If you storm in and you start cutting off missionaries, you're going to have a very short-lived career at this church. But if this is the elders of the church's idea, this is the missions committee idea, which you're a part of, but you're hiding behind the missions committee here, then you have this layer of protection. This is something the missions committee has decided to do. Again, if you try to be the one-man show on this, forget about it. And then finally, let me tell you how STM fits into the short-term missions. Most STMs are focused on the individual going, we want to give you a heightened religious experience in a foreign setting, change your life forever kind of STM trip. They're focused on street evangelism and mercy ministry, painting your face like a clown and dancing around, which, by the way, could both be better done with money by locals. Rather than sending people over at $5,000 a pop to build a church in Malawi, why not send, how much do you think it would cost construction workers in Malawi to do the same thing? But anyway, your STM is not going to be like that. If you cast this vision of missions at your church, your STM will not be that. Your STM will come alongside of your missionaries. It will actually serve your missionaries. Instead of flooding them with numerous trips all year, you have one group that's coming to actually meet this missionary's needs. So maybe he does need a building built, and you have a group that can come do it. Maybe he does need street evangelism or VBS or an ESL class. You have a group that can come do it. But the bottom line is your missionary knows what he needs better than you do. You can accomplish things that only your church could accomplish. The bottom line is that oftentimes people's generosity is not coinciding with what a missionary's actual needs are. You could have a person who says, I really want to buy our missionary X, and the missionary doesn't need X. The missionary needs Y. The missionary might say, I really need an STM team that can come do this. Here's a great example from Grace Church. Rob Anthony, a missionary in France, he really needs STM teams that can come and lead basketball tournaments. He's doing ministry in Muslim slums. He can't have people in his own church. They don't play basketball. He can't have people in his own church come do a basketball clinic. But Americans can come and do a basketball clinic. Well, we wouldn't have thought of that left on our own here. We wouldn't have thought, we should send an STM team that can play basketball in France. We never would have come up with that. But the missionary there does, so we can meet his actual need. There's all kinds of examples of that kind of stuff. And this will give your people a heart for missions and for giving to their missionaries. And that's because you guys have an actual connection with your missionary, or your missionaries, plural. And this is a long-term vision, of course, for missions work. Long-term. Patience rules the day in this.